March 25, 1945. Deep inside the impenetrable green hell of the Sarawak Highlands, the first thing Major Tom Harrison's Z Special Unit Commandos saw were the heads. They were Japanese heads, dozens of them, weathered and fresh, mounted on sharpened bamboo poles that lined the path to a Kelabit longhouse. A grotesque welcome mat. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and rot, hung heavy and still. For the 8 Australians dropped by parachute into this vast, unmapped wilderness only days before, this was the moment of truth. This was not an enemy atrocity. This was a greeting, an invitation from the ancient tribes of Borneo, the Iban, the Kenya, the Kayan. People known by another more chilling name, a name whispered in terror through the isolated Japanese garrisons from Balikpapan to Sandakan. Headhunters. The rumors, it turned out, were true. The rumors always were. Far away, the official war in the Pacific was a colossal, industrial affair of aircraft carriers dueling in the open ocean, and entire divisions storming black sand beaches. A grand strategy dictated from Washington and Canberra. They called the Borneo campaign Obo, a series of 6 massive amphibious landings designed to reclaim the island's vital oil fields. A campaign many in General MacArthur's own headquarters privately and later publicly dismissed as a strategically bankrupt, bloody sideshow. A pointless waste of Australian lives for territory the war had already bypassed. The press releases spoke of liberation. The private memos spoke of political maneuvering. But the official history was incomplete. Deep within the archives, a folder, its corners softened with age and stamped top secret, holds the first whispers of a different war. Its code name was Operation Samut, the Malay word for ant. The reports inside sketch out an audacious, almost suicidal plan. It stated that small teams of Allied operatives, a mere handful of men, were to be dropped deep behind enemy lines. Men like 34-year-old Tom Harrison, a brilliant, eccentric, and often insubordinate ornithologist who knew more about Bornean birds than British military protocol. Their mission seemed impossible: to gather intelligence, to foster rebellion, and to raise a native army from scratch to wage guerrilla war against 50,000 entrenched, battle-hardened Japanese soldiers. Nobody in high command truly believed it could work. It was a desperate gamble, a shot in the dark. But then the messages began to trickle out of the jungle, carried by native runners or crackling faintly over the radio. They were not reports. They were rumors. Rumors of a bizarre and terrifyingly effective alliance. They spoke of Australian sergeants, boys from Melbourne and the outback, learning to hunt with silent blowpipes and living on a diet of sago grubs and snake. They whispered of Dayak warriors, men with elongated earlobes and bodies covered in intricate tattoos, now armed with modern Sten guns and ancient parang swords, melting into the jungle after raids that left no survivors, only grisly trophies. Trophies the Japanese command had forbidden their soldiers from even mentioning in letters home, for fear of collapsing morale. This is the story of that unlikely pact, an alliance forged not in a treaty room, but in the sweltering humidity of a communal longhouse, sealed over gourds of rice wine and the observation of ancient, sacred rituals. It is a story of a desperate rescue mission, not just for the hundreds of downed Allied airmen and emaciated prisoners of war hidden in the interior, but for a forgotten campaign's very soul. A story pieced together from heavily censored operational reports, faded personal diaries that reek of mildew and truth, and the living memory of 2 worlds that collided in violence and camaraderie to fight a common, hated enemy. This is the story of what happens when the rules of war are abandoned, and the only law left is the law of the jungle. April 12, 1945. Allied Forward Base, Morotai Island. The order was a ghost, a piece of paper that few men saw but everyone felt. It had a name, a strange, almost whimsical name for what was coming. Operation Obo, a final bloody symphony for a war that was already won. The war in Europe was over in weeks. Hitler was in his bunker. Berlin was about to burn. In the Pacific, American Marines were dying on Okinawa. the last stepping stone to Japan itself. The end was in sight, a terrible, blindingly bright end. But not here, not for the Australians. The folder was called Obo Strategic Directive. Inside, a map of Borneo, a vast green stain on the blue of the Southwest Pacific. On the vellum overlay, 3 circles marked in red grease pencil by a hand in General MacArthur's Brisbane headquarters. They looked like blood drops on the jungle. The first on the northeast coast, Tarakan Island. The second further west encircling Brunei Bay and the island of Labuan. The final and largest on the southeast coast, Balikpapan. Oil, harbors, airfields. That was the official reason. Strategic assets. Assets for a war that was already moving on. The whispers had started months before, in the humid mess halls of Morotai, in the quiet offices in Canberra. Why Borneo? The Americans weren't interested. Not really. Admiral Chester Nimitz was driving his fleet straight towards the Japanese home islands. Admiral Ernest King, the famously abrasive chief of naval operations in Washington, saw it as a sideshow. A foolish diversion of precious naval support, of landing craft, of air cover. A waste, he said it, not in public. But he said it. So the question lingered in the thick tropical air. Why? The answer was pride. A terrible, costly pride. Terrible? General Sir Thomas Blamey, commander of the Australian military forces, would not be sidelined. His men, the tough, seasoned veterans of the 6th, 7th, and 9th Divisions, had been relegated to mopping up duties on New Guinea and Bougainville, fighting a forgotten war against bypassed Japanese garrisons. They were the Forgotten Army. Blamey wanted them back on the main stage. The Australian government wanted a voice in the post-war settlement, a voice paid for in the only currency that mattered in 1945. Blood. A political war, not a military one. That's what the cynics said. In a dusty archive box, there is a sketch. Not a photograph, but an artist's rendering, drawn with charcoal on cheap paper, the kind found in a soldier's kit. It shows the future. It shows the landings. An LVT, an alligator, churns through the surf, its ramp dropping into the gray water. Men spill out, their faces obscured by helmets and the sheer velocity of the moment. They are silhouettes against a shoreline lit by explosions. Black smoke, thick and oily, billows from the palm trees. In the background, the faint outline of a destroyer, its guns winking fire. There is no glory in the sketch, only chaos, water, and forward motion. The drawing has no title. It doesn't need one. It is the visual translation of the red circles on the map. The plan was broken into pieces. Neat, numbered pieces. Obo 1 for Tarakan, to be executed by the 26th Brigade Group. Obo 6 for Brunei Bay, a task for the vaunted 9th Division. Obo 2 for Balikpapan, the biggest show of all, assigned to the battle-hardened 7th Division. May, June, July. A precise 3-act tragedy. From the staging grounds on Morotai, the vast armada would sail. Landing ships, destroyers, cruisers, even escort carriers. An immense concentration of force for an island the wider war had already left behind. 3 landings, 3 battles. 3 red circles on a map. The men of the Australian Corps knew only the waiting. They cleaned their rifles. They waterproofed their gear. They played cards and wrote letters home filled with vague assurances. They were the best troops Australia had. Veterans of Bardia, Tobruk, Syria, Kokoda, Leh, Finschhafen. They had fought Rommel's Africa Corps and the elite of the Imperial Japanese Army. They had endured desert heat and jungle rot. They thought they had done their part. They were wrong. The orders were cut, the logistics finalized, the ships loaded with men, with tanks, with ammunition, with fuel, with everything needed to wage a modern war. From MacArthur's headquarters, it was a grand strategic maneuver. The final assertion of Allied dominance in the Southwest Pacific. For the Australian government, it was a political necessity. But for the 33,000 Australian soldiers who would eventually land on that dark shore, it was something else entirely. It was a question without an answer. And as the first troop transports slipped their moorings under the May moon, heading for Tarakan, one thought was absent from their official briefings. No one spoke of the island's interior. No one mentioned the tribes, the headhunters, or the small teams of ghosts already operating deep in the jungle. The men in Z Special Unit. The men who had already seen the future. May 3rd, 1945. Morotai Island. The number was the first real secret. Not a rumor passed in a sweaty tent, not a whisper over a crackling radio. A number on a manifest, stamped and classified. 100,000 men. A city of soldiers waiting on a jungle-choked rock in the middle of nowhere. Waiting for an order that still felt like a ghost. They said it was the largest amphibious operation the Allies would mount in the Southwest Pacific. They said it, but nobody could truly comprehend it. 100,000. That's more people than lived in Hobart. A nation's strength gathered for a single bloody purpose. This was Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead's Australian Wine Corps. The old fox of Tobruk was in command, a hard man for a hard job. His divisions were the heart of it. The legendary 7th, the formidable 9th. Men who had tasted dust and fire in the deserts of North Africa, now retrained in the suffocating green damp of the jungle. More diggers than were thrown at the cliffs of Gallipoli. More than held the line at Tobruk. This was different. This was bigger. This was everything. The files listed them by the thousand. Infantry, engineers, artillerymen, medics. Page after page of names. Smith, Jones, O'Malley, Nguyen, Papadopoulos. The new Australia come to fight an old war. And they were not alone. Never alone. The sea belonged to the Americans. Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbee's 7th Fleet. A gray wall of steel that stretched to the horizon. The cruisers USS Phoenix, USS Boise, the Australian HMAS Shropshire, a dozen more. Destroyers like hunting dogs. Rocket ships, landing craft, transports. A fleet so vast it churned the sea into a muddy broth. The sky belonged to them too. To the U.S. 13th Air Force and the RAAF's 1st Tactical Air Force. A constant deafening roar of engines. B-24 Liberators, B-25 Mitchells, Beaufighters, Kitty Hawks. They flew in formations that blotted out the sun, their silver fuselages catching the light before they wheeled toward the unseen enemy. The air hummed with power. American power. Australian resolve. A combined fist. But the plan was full of holes, full of maybes. The first problem was the water itself. A secret report, code-named Neptune's Teeth, showed the approaches littered with mines. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. Japanese ordnance laid in precise interlocking patterns, waiting in the murky depths. So they sent in the little ships. The minesweepers. Australian-built corvettes, mostly. HMAS Katoomba, HMAS Ballarat, HMAS Bendigo. Small ships with big jobs, crewed by men who knew that one mistake, one missed signal, one moment of inattention meant oblivion. For days they swept, back and forth, dragging their paravanes through the silent, deadly water. Everyone on the transport ships watched them, tiny specks on a vast ocean doing the most terrifying job in the world, waiting for an explosion that never came, or an explosion that did. Then came the fire, the preliminary bombardment. The official documents called it softening, a clinical, clean word for 7 days of hell. For 168 hours, the world was nothing but noise and concussion. The big guns of the cruisers and destroyers spoke first, their shells arcing miles across the water to pulverize the beaches. Then came the planes, dropping bombs in endless sticks, thousands of tons of high explosives. They didn't just aim for gun emplacements or pillboxes, they aimed for the jungle itself, tearing it open, shredding the ancient trees, turning green paradise into a splintered, smoking wasteland. They were trying to kill an enemy they couldn't see, trying to carve a path with fire. In a dusty folio in a Canberra archive, we found the sketches. Charcoal on cheap, yellowed paper, drawn by an anonymous war artist. He saw it. He captured it. One sketch shows a lone Australian infantryman, his jaw set, his Owen gun held high as he wades through the surf. But he is small, almost insignificant, because behind him looms the colossal gray silhouette of an American cruiser, its main battery spitting tongues of orange flame. And above him, the sky is not blue but black. Black with the shapes of RAF bow fighters and American liberators, a swarm of metal and death. The artist understood. The individual soldier, the hero, was just one cog in a terrifying, overwhelming machine. A machine of incredible power. Bravery was not a line in a report. It was a moment of madness. A man deciding he would not die. At least not yet. The citations for the Victoria Crosses read like boys' adventure novels. Impossible feats of courage. Private Leslie Thomas Starkovich of the 9th Division, charging 2 Japanese machine gun posts by himself. Alone. Firing a Bren gun from the hip until it was empty, then continuing with a rifle. Private Frank John Partridge grabbing a grenade and a knife to take out a bunker that had pinned his platoon down. Just a piece of bronze shaped like a cross. For a moment that defied all logic. The troops waited. The 100,000. They cleaned their weapons for the 10th time. They read letters from home until the words blurred. They stared at the smoke rising from the coastline, a dark pillar against the tropical sky. The sea was clear, the beaches were burning, the machine was assembled. Every man, from General Morshead down to the youngest private, knew they were part of the most powerful force their country had ever put into the field. A hammer, forged in secret, ready to fall. But the intelligence was a mess. Whispers of fanatical resistance. Rumors of hidden fortifications the bombardments hadn't touched. Ghosts in the jungle. The signal would come soon. They were going in. And they were going in almost blind. May 3rd, 1945. Morotai Island. The number was the first real secret. Not a rumor passed in a sweaty tent, not a whisper over a crackling radio. A number on a manifest stamped and classified. 400. That was the number. 400 sets of equipment. 400 rifles. 400 destinies packed in crates waiting under the dripping canvas. 400... what? Allies? Agents? Nobody said the word. They just pointed to the folder. The folder was called Ethnographic Survey, Borneo, Section C. Inside there were drawings, not photographs. The reconnaissance planes couldn't get that low. Couldn't see through the triple canopy. The sketches were old, pulled from Dutch colonial archives in the dusty libraries of Singapore. They showed men. Men with long hair, shields painted with demonic faces, and swords that looked like a butcher's cleaver. Parangs. They were called Parangs. The captions read, Ibn Warrior, Kayan Chief, Kanya Hunter. To the young Australian soldiers, boys from Melbourne and Perth who had never seen anything wilder than a kangaroo, they all had one name, Headhunters. The stereotype was a comfortable one. Simple. It fit neatly into the propaganda posters back home. Wild natives, noble savages, waiting for civilized men to lead them against the Japanese invader. But the folder told another story. A much more complicated story. Major G.L. Roberts, a 40-year-old anthropologist pulled from a quiet university post, saw it first. He saw the notes in the margins, the frantic scribbles from patrol officers and missionaries from before the war. Notes on culture, on belief, on pride. Pride was the key. A fierce, unbending pride. One sketch was paper-clipped to a report. It showed a Dayak warrior, lean and hard, muscles coiled like jungle vines. He wore a loincloth, a feathered cap, and nothing else. His skin was a tapestry of intricate blue-black tattoos, swirling patterns that told the story of his life, his travels, his kills. In his hand, a blowpipe of polished ironwood, 8 feet long. Beside it, someone had placed a photograph, a stark black and white portrait of Sergeant Jack Keenan, 26 Z Special Unit. Keenan was broad-shouldered with a square jaw and short-cropped hair, his jungle green uniform stained dark with sweat. He held a Sten gun. The juxtaposition was jarring. The ancient and the modern. The spirit world and the world of cordite. One fought for his ancestors and the spirits of the forest, the Antu. The other fought for king and country. Could they ever truly fight together? That was the question nobody dared to ask aloud. The Dayaks were not one people. They were a river of peoples. Iban, Bidayu, Kayan, Konya, Kelabit, Murut, Punan. Hundreds of tribes, hundreds of dialects. They lived in longhouses, great wooden arks perched on stilts, whole villages under a single roof. Their world was the river, their law was the adat, and their memory was long, very long. They remembered the Brooke family, the white Rajas who had ruled Sarawak for 100 years. They remembered the punitive expeditions, the burning longhouses, the forced allegiances. Some tribes had sided with the Brookes, others had fought them for generations. Their loyalties were not to flags, not to empires. Their loyalties were to their ancestors, their families, their rivers, and to revenge. Then the Japanese came. The Japanese occupation was different. It was not the clumsy paternalism of the British or the Dutch. It was cold. It was systematic. The Kempe Tai were crueler than any Brooke punitive force. They did not just burn a longhouse, they lined up the elders and executed them. They took the rice. They took the women. They demanded slave labor. They demanded utter, absolute submission. They did not understand the audit. They did not understand pride. The Dayaks watched. They waited. The headhunting raids, which the Brookes had spent a century trying to stamp out, began again. But this time, the targets were different. The heads were not for ritual. They were for retribution. Japanese heads. The reports in Major Roberts' folder tried to quantify this. Tried to put it into military language. Report 7B, Iban disposition. Hostile to Japanese authority due to resource confiscation. Report 11A, Kenya tribes of the Upper Baram region, actively engaging in guerrilla actions. The words were dry, clinical. They failed to capture the truth. The truth of a village chief finding his son's headless body. The truth of a woman watching a Japanese soldier carry off the last sack of rice. This wasn't about strategy. This was about hate. A pure, primal hate the Australians could only begin to comprehend. So the planners on Morotai looked at their maps. They looked at the sketches of tattooed warriors and the cold statistics on rifle distribution. They believed they were dropping into a void to arm a simple people against a common enemy. A simple transaction. Guns for heads. But it was never that simple. The Dayaks' ambivalence was a razor's edge. They hated the Japanese, but they did not trust outsiders, not the Dutch, not the British, and not these new men, the Australians, who were about to fall from the sky. The folder was closed, the decision was made. The 400 sets of equipment would be loaded, the men of Z Special Unit would go. They thought they knew the mission. They thought they understood the allies they were sent to find. They had a file full of facts. But the jungle does not care for facts. The Australians were bringing guns and promises. The Dayaks were bringing ghosts. June 13th, 1945. The Barrio Highlands, Sarawak. They fell from a myth. Out of the belly of a metal bird that roared louder than any god the jungle had ever known. 8 men. That was Samut 1. 8 men dropping into a green ocean. An ocean with no shore. The parachutes blossomed like impossible white flowers in the twilight, then vanished. Swallowed by the trees. The B-24 Liberator circled once, a lonely predator, and flew away. Then, nothing. Only the hum of a billion insects. A sound older than memory. Major Tom Harrison, 34, landed hard. An ornithologist who studied birds, now a ghost falling from the sky. Beside him, Sergeant Fred Sanderson checked his Steen gun, a Queenslander with hands made of leather and steel. They had a radio they couldn't use yet, cyanide pills they hoped they'd never use, and 50 words of broken Malay. 50 words to tame a world. The mission folder was codenamed Tarsier, a small primate with enormous eyes. Eyes that see in the dark. That's what they had to become. They had no maps, no real maps. Just aerial photographs, strange gray squares that bore no resemblance to the suffocating reality on the ground. The jungle was a wall of life and death, and they were inside it. They were blind. They were deaf. They were waiting. For what, they did not know. A Japanese patrol. A venomous snake. Or something else entirely, something the files in Moritai never mentioned. And then they came, out of the green, silent as mist. Small, powerful men with dark, watching eyes. Their skin was the color of the earth, their hair long and black. Some carried long, gleaming parangs. Others held 8-foot blowpipes tipped with poison darts. They were the Kelabit people, a tribe of the Dayak, Headhunters. The rumors were true. The silence was a physical thing, a weight. Harrison stood up slowly. He raised an open hand, a gesture that could mean peace or utter foolishness. He spoke a word. Selamat. A greeting. The sound was swallowed by the jungle. One of the Dayaks, a man with heavy brass earrings stretching his lobes, tilted his head. He did not smile. He just watched. He was Penghulu Lawai, a chief. A man whose word was law and whose judgment was final. He saw not soldiers, but strange, pale spirits fallen from the heavens. Spirits with powerful new magic. The language barrier was a chasm. Not a gap, a chasm. Every conversation was a pantomime, a desperate game of charades played for the highest stakes. Harrison pointed to his gun, then pointed towards the coast. Jepun, he said. The word hung in the humid air. The Dayaks knew that word. They knew the cruelty that came with it. The forced labor, the stolen rice, the casual brutality. A flicker of understanding, not friendship. Just a shared enemy. That was the start. The only start that mattered. Respect was the bridge across the chasm. The Australians were not masters. They were guests. They ate the food they were given. They slept in the longhouses. They learned the customs. They learned not to step on certain thresholds, not to touch a man's head. They brought gifts, salt, tobacco, medicine, bright red cloth. But the real gift was a promise of revenge. The Dayaks, fierce and proud, had been humiliated by the Japanese. Harrison's 8 men offered them the tools to reclaim their honor. The training was a surreal exchange of deadly arts, a scene that no military manual could ever contain. A young Dayak warrior, maybe 17, eyes wide, holding a British Sten gun for the first time. The strange, oily weight of it. Sergeant Sanderson showing him the bolt, the trigger, the magazine. The boy fires. A deafening burst of noise that scatters birds for a mile. A new kind of thunder. In return, the boy shows Sanderson the silent language of the jungle. A broken twig means a patrol passed an hour ago. The cry of a certain bird means strangers are on the river. The Australians taught them modern war. The Dayaks taught them how to survive it. Soon, the jungle had new ghosts. The whispers started in the Japanese garrisons downriver. Of patrols that went into the green and never came out. Not a sound, no firefight, just gone. A report from a Japanese lieutenant at Longaka dated July 2nd, 1945. It spoke of spirit assassins. Men who struck from nowhere and vanished. One ambush, near a tributary of the Baram River. A Japanese squad of 12 men, moving in a single file down a narrow track. Complacent. Arrogant. They heard nothing. They saw nothing. From the canopy above and the undergrowth beside them came the storm. It was not just gunfire. It was the hiss of poisoned darts finding their marks, silent and lethal. It was the terrifying war cry of the Dayak as they charged with parangs flashing, a storm of steel, lead, and primal fury. It was over in 30 seconds. 30 seconds of screaming chaos. The Australians, Sanderson, Harrison, provided the covering fire. The Dayaks did the wet work. The report back to base was simple. Enemy patrol eliminated, no casualties. But the truth was written in blood on the jungle floor. The intelligence was the real prize. The Dayak network was better than any radio. They moved through the jungle like water, unseen, unheard. They became the eyes and ears of Z Special Unit. They brought back names, numbers, locations, a Japanese supply dump hidden near Marudi, the schedule of the boat that carried the regional commander, the exact number of guards at a key outpost. This was not just warfare, this was surgery. The Dayaks provided the diagnosis. The Allied command prepared the knife. But the Japanese were not fools. They were learning. They started sending out larger patrols. They began offering bounties. Bounties for a white man's head. The price was high, the fear was growing, retaliation was coming. Harrison knew it. He could feel it in the air, a new tension in the longhouse at night. They had armed the jungle. They had given it guns and a target. They had created an army of ghosts. Now they had to face the demons they had summoned. August 17th, 1945. Ranau, British North Borneo. 6. That was the number. Not a rumor whispered over a crackling radio, not a guess scrawled on a map. A hard, final, sickening number. 6 men had survived the Sandakan prisoner of war camp out of an original 2,434. 6. The rest were ghosts, their bodies seeding the jungle floor along a 160-mile trail of forced marches and casual murder. A trail of tears and blood and bone. The Japanese called it a transfer. The men who walked it and died on it called it the Death March. This was no longer about Samut, no longer about intelligence or sabotage or raising a guerrilla army. This was about something older, something more fundamental. It was a rescue, a desperate, frantic clawing back of life from the very jaws of death. The war was over, they said. Surrender papers signed in Tokyo Bay. But here in the suffocating green cathedral of Borneo, the war was not over. For the men with hollow eyes and skeletal frames, the war was in their blood, in their bellies, in their minds. The war would never be over. A sketch tucked into the logbook of a Z Special Unit medic, Corporal Alan Russell. Charcoal on thin paper, smudged by sweat and humidity. It shows a man, barely a man, being carried in a makeshift sling between 2 Dayak warriors. The man's ribs are a cage you can see through his skin. His head lolls back, mouth open, a black hole in a skull-like face. The Dayaks are solid, muscular, their expressions grim, their bare feet placed with impossible care on the treacherous jungle path. Below the sketch, a single line of hurried script. POW ex Sandakan, found near Baluran, name unknown, still breathing. That was the humanitarian mission. Finding the ones still breathing, they were the true pathfinders, the silent partners in Operation Samut, the Dayak, Iban, Kelabit, Murut, Kayan. They knew the jungle not as an enemy, but as a home the Japanese had invaded. They moved through the canopy's gloom like wraiths, their parangs sharp, their blowpipes silent. They brought whispers to the Z-men, whispers of pale men, sick men, marching in chains, whispers of guards who killed for sport. They led Harrison's commandos and the Australian infantry who followed, along secret river routes, through leech-infested swamps and over razorback ridges the Japanese maps never showed. They were the eyes, the ears, and often the executioners. A report from Lieutenant Bob Tredrea attached to the 9th Division. The folder was simply titled Native Liaison. It read like a ledger of miracles. August 20th. Received word from Headman Miri of a small group of internees, mostly women and children, hidden in a Jesuit mission near Jesselton. Miri's scouts confirmed Japanese patrols were sweeping the area. Evacuation imperative. The mission was a gamble, a long shot. But Miri's men knew a way. a river that ran underground for half a mile. The children were the hardest. Their silence was worse than any scream. Little Dutch and British boys and girls with old eyes. They had forgotten what a full stomach felt like. They flinched at loud noises, at the sight of a uniform. A photograph slightly out of focus shows an Australian digger, a big sunburnt man named Sergeant Frank Chook Fowler, holding a small Dutch girl. He's offering her a piece of chocolate, a treasure more valuable than gold. She just stares, not at the chocolate, at his face, as if trying to remember what kindness looked like. Fowler, Hayes, Richards, Peterson, O'Malley. These men became more than soldiers. They became saviors. The Dayaks were the key. Always the key. They ambushed Japanese patrols sent to hunt the escapees. They brought food, sago, tapioca, fish speared in the dead of night. They guided downed airmen through hundreds of miles of jungle to safety. A pilot from the Royal Australian Air Force, Flight Lieutenant John Scotty Allen, owed his life to a Cayenne scout named Balin. For 52 days, Balin hid him, fed him, and guided him, communicating with gestures and drawings in the dirt. Allen's official debrief contained a strange addendum, a request for a reward, not money, but salt. 10 bags of salt for Balin's village. A life for 10 bags of salt. In the jungle, it was a fair trade. The liberation of the Batu Lintang camp in Kuching was different. It was a formal affair, surrender, ceremony. But the truth was found inside the wire. 2,019 prisoners. POWs and civilian internees. Men, women, children. Emaciated. Riddled with disease. They had been days from execution. The camp commander, Colonel Tatsuji Suga, had a standing order. In the event of an Allied landing, all prisoners were to be killed. The atomic bombs had saved them, by days, maybe hours. But the real story was never in the official tallies. It was in the margins, in the fragments, in the things the survivors whispered late at night. One of them, a gaunt Australian gunner named Keith Botterill, one of the 6 Sandakan survivors, was found by a Semet patrol led by a Dayak named Leedy. Botterill was delirious, crawling on his hands and knees. When they finally got him to the field hospital, he spoke of a list, a leather-bound book, kept by a Japanese quartermaster, a man who sold medicine on the black market. Medicine meant for the prisoners. He sold it to civilians in Sandakan town. Botterill had seen the names of the buyers. He remembered some of them. Not Japanese names. Chinese, Malay, even European names. Collaborators, profiteers of death. The rescuers had found the living. They had counted the dead. But now a new hunt was beginning. A hunt for the ghouls. The ones who had stood by and watched. The ones who had profited. Botterill's story was a spark. And in the humid, rotting atmosphere of post-war Borneo, that spark was about to find a powder keg. July 3rd, 1945. The Lawas River, Sarawak. The Japanese called it the illness of the trees. It was not a fever, not a jungle rot. It was a dying. A slow, methodical, terrifying dying that had no doctor, no cure. A sentry on watch at a riverside depot would simply disappear. A patrol of 10 men sent up a familiar track to check a wire would never return. No gunshots, no explosions, just silence. The jungle had swallowed them whole. The illness of the trees. A beautiful, poetic name for a very ugly thing. It was not an illness. It was an army of ghosts. Major Tom Harrison's 8 men from Z Special Unit, the ones who fell from the sky, were the seeds. The jungle was the soil. The Dayak warriors were the harvest, hundreds of them, then thousands. Ibn, Kelabit, Kunya, Murut, men whose grandfathers had taken heads for honor. Now, the Australians gave them a new kind of honor, and new targets. The Japanese occupiers. They moved through the jungle, not on it. They were a part of it. A living, breathing part of the green hell that the Japanese so feared. Their weapons were ancient and modern, a ghastly fusion of old and new. The silent Sumpaton blowpipe, its tiny dart tipped with poison from the Anti-Aris toxicaria tree, a poison that killed without a sound. The razor-sharp paring wo, a heavy blade that could sever a limb in a single practice stroke. And now, Sten guns. Owen submachine guns. Grenades. A deadly combination. The war was 1,000 pinpricks. 1,000 cuts that bled the enemy dry. It was not a war of front lines and battle plans. It was a war of whispers and shadows. The folder in Melbourne was labeled Operation Samut, but on the ground it had no name. It was just the work. A report from Sergeant Ken Thompson, Z Special Unit, dated July 10th. Engaged patrol of 12 Japs near Long Barang. Pesu Atek's men used blowpipes on point and rear guards. Silent takedown. We opened up with the Bren from high ground. Total success. No losses on our side. Captured one officer. He was terrified, kept looking at the trees. Not at us. At the trees. A crude sketch was found in Thompson's notebook. It was a map of an ambush. A hand-drawn sketch of a river bend. A narrow jungle path runs parallel to the water. A large X marks a spot on the path. Dozens of small circles are drawn in the dense foliage overlooking the path, forming a long, curved line. A smaller group of circles marked Bren and Owen are positioned at one end of the curve, creating an L shape. Arrows point from all circles toward the path. A note at the bottom reads, "They walk into the L." Sumpatans start from the far end. We hit them from the base when they bunch up. No escape route. River on one side, us on the other. This was the new warfare. Unconventional. Unstoppable. While the main Allied forces, the massive amphibious armadas of the 9th Australian Division, prepared to storm the beaches at Labuan and Brunei Bay, this secret war raged in the interior. It was the perfect complement. A symphony of destruction. The Japanese commanders on the coast looked over their shoulders. They heard rumors. Stories of whole garrisons vanishing. They requested reinforcements from the interior, but the reinforcements could not come. The roads were cut. The rivers were watched. The jungle itself was hostile. Every Japanese soldier sent to hunt Dayak ghosts was one less soldier facing the Australians on the beach. Every supply convoy ambushed in a highland pass was one less box of ammunition for the coastal defenses. It was strangulation. Slow, methodical, and complete. They were tied down, pinned in place by an enemy they could not see and could not fight. A captured diary belonging to a Corporal Watanabe Eiji tells the story better than any Allied report. 6th day of patrol. Morale is low. Tanaka-san was taken last night. He was 10 feet from me. There was a sound like a sigh. When I turned, he was gone. There was only a small dart in the tree where his head had been. We are not fighting men. We are fighting the yokai, the spirits of the jungle. They watch us from every leaf, every branch. We shoot at shadows. We waste ammunition. The officer tells us to be brave for the Emperor. But the Emperor is not here. Only the trees are here. And they are hungry. Another sketch, this one drawn on the back of a Japanese supply manifest, shows a different tactic. Sabotage. A simple diagram of a small wooden bridge over a creek. Lines indicate where support struts are to be sawed almost all the way through. A separate drawing shows a tripwire connected to a cluster of grenades hidden in the undergrowth at the bridge's exit. Notes in the margin: wait for truck, heavy one, let front wheels cross. Detonate grenades at rear to stop reverse. Bridge will do the rest. It was brilliant, and it was brutal. By early August 1945, Harrison's small band of operatives and their indigenous army had killed or captured over 1,500 Japanese soldiers. They had taken control of a vast territory, an area the size of England, without a single artillery piece or tank. They had done it with blowpipes, blades, and a few crates of smuggled guns. They had done it by becoming the illness of the trees. The final act was approaching. The main invasions were a success, but pockets of fierce Japanese resistance remained, cut off and desperate. One such pocket was at the settlement of Ranau in British North Borneo. The report said they held prisoners, Allied prisoners. The Dayaks brought the news they had seen them, sickly, starving. Z Special Unit received a new order, a different kind of order, not to ambush a patrol, not to sabotage a bridge. The order was simple: get the prisoners. Sergeant Jack Digger Rawlings, a former sheep farmer from Wagga Wagga, looked at the Murut warriors gathered around him. Their faces were grim, their eyes ancient. They held their blowpipes and their new Australian rifles with equal comfort. They were ready. Rawlings checked his Owen gun one last time. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and coming rain. And something else. The smell of death. Waiting. He knew this would be different. This was not a hit and run. This was a rescue. Or a slaughter. There was no turning back now. The jungle held its breath. November 11th, 1948. Canberra, Australia. The metal felt cold. Colder than the marble of the War Memorial. A simple bronze octagon. The Pacific Star. On the back, the recipient's name. His name. He traced the letters. He remembered the heat, the sweat, the smell of cordite and rot. He remembered the faces. The ones who came back and the ones who did not. They called it the Forgotten War. But he had not forgotten. Nobody who was there had forgotten. They just stopped talking about it. Was it worth it? The question hung in the quiet Canberra air. A ghost at the Feast of Remembrance. The Borneo Campaign. Operation Oboe. A name that sounded almost musical. There was no music. Only the discordant symphony of war. The official histories were being written. Words carefully chosen, sentences polished like boots for a parade. They spoke of strategic objectives, of securing vital oil resources, of liberating occupied territories. Facts. But facts are not always the truth. The whispers had started long before, in 1945. In the humid corridors of Allied Forward Base, Morotai Island. The Australians knew, the senior officers knew. General Sir Thomas Blamey, Commander-in-Chief of the Australian Military Forces, knew. He flew to see MacArthur. The report of that meeting was buried deep. File AMF MacArthur 45B. It hinted at a disagreement, a polite military-grade disagreement. Blamey questioned the necessity. The war was moving north, fast. The Americans were on Okinawa's doorstep. Japan was being pummeled from the sky. So why Borneo? Why a massive, costly invasion of an island the war had already left behind? The answer had a name. MacArthur. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. His portrait hung in every command tent. The imperious gaze, the corncob pipe, the carefully curated image of a modern Caesar. He had made a promise to the Philippines. I shall return. He had returned. But Borneo was not the Philippines. The rumors said he needed to keep the Australians busy, the tough, battle-hardened men of the 7th and 9th Divisions. Too good to be left idle. Too independent, perhaps, for the final all-American push on Japan. A political move? A move on a global chessboard where Australian soldiers were pawns. Sacrificial pawns. Canberra had protested quietly. Prime Minister John Curtin had fought for an Australian voice in the war's direction, but Curtin was dead by July 1945. He died while his men were fighting and dying in the mud of Balikpapan. And the war machine ground on. Always on. 643. That was the number, not a rumor. Not a politician's estimate. The final brutal tally. 643 Australian dead. More than 2,000 wounded. For what? For the oil fields of Tarakan, which were so thoroughly demolished they produced nothing for the war effort. For the port of Balikpapan, taken just weeks before the atom bombs fell. Weeks. The cost was written in telegrams sent to homes in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Perth. It was written on the faces of the men who lay in hospital beds, their bodies broken. It was a high price, a terribly high price for a strategic sideshow, a bloody, pointless sideshow. That's what the soldiers whispered. That's what the families cried. And yet, a legacy remained, a complex, contradictory legacy. Look at the photographs, the official ones. They show the sheer scale of it, the largest amphibious operation in Australia's history. Landing craft hitting the beaches at Labuan, at Brunei Bay, at Balikpapan. Meticulously planned, flawlessly executed. General Leslie Morshead, the commander of I Australian Corps, the Old Fox of Tobruk. He ran a professional, lethal operation. His men, veterans of the desert and New Guinea, were masters of their craft. The campaign was a testament to their skill, their discipline, their courage under fire. It became a chapter in the textbooks at Duntroon, the Royal Military College. A case study in joint operations. A military masterpiece without a clear military purpose. A perfect answer to the wrong question. Then there was the other legacy, the one not found in military textbooks. It was found deep in the jungle, in the highlands of Sarawak and British North Borneo. It was the legacy of an alliance that should not have existed. The Dayaks, the Ebens, the Kelabits, the Muruts. Men the British Empire had labeled headhunters, savages, primitive. Tom Harrison's Z Special Unit saw something else. They saw warriors. They saw allies. They saw men who knew the jungle as well as a Sydney clerk knew his own street. A portrait from that time shows a young Iban warrior decorated with hornbill feathers holding a captured Japanese rifle. Beside him, a lanky Australian commando, barely 20, with a grin and a Sten gun. They were equals. Brothers in a secret war fought with blowpipes, parangs, and explosives. This alliance shattered racial stereotypes. It proved that courage and loyalty had no skin color. It was a quiet challenge to the very idea of empire, a challenge written in blood and trust. And finally, the humanitarian achievement, the part no one could dispute. The reason some men looked at their medals with a sense of grim pride, not just bitter regret. The liberation, the skeletal figures who emerged from the prison camps at Kuching, the 6 survivors of the Sandakan death marches found by Australian units at Ranau. 6 out of more than 2,000. Freeing them was not a strategic objective, it was a moral duty. The Australian military government units moved in behind the combat troops. They were engineers, doctors, administrators. They purified water, distributed rice, vaccinated children, hunted down war criminals. The photographs from this time are different. No explosions, no grim-faced soldiers. Just an Australian medic gently cleaning a wound on a child's leg. A supply sergeant handing a can of bully beef to a starving local elder. This was the other war. The war to restore life. A legacy that endured long after the guns fell silent. The Pacific Star still felt cold in his hand. 1 medal for a campaign of contradictions. A strategic folly. A tactical triumph. A politician's game, a soldier's graveyard, an act of liberation. It was all of these things. It was a war of ghosts and heroes, of pointless sacrifice and profound achievement. The official files in Canberra were stamped closed. The history was written. But in the quiet corners of the country, the questions remained. And the ghosts of Borneo, they never went away. What becomes of a war when its most pivotal chapter is written in a language no historian can speak? When its truths are not recorded in ink on paper, but carved by memory into the very heartwood of the jungle itself? The official story is one of grim necessity. A story told in tonnage and timetables, broadcast from the relative sanity of General MacArthur's Brisbane headquarters. It speaks of the strategic imperative of the Tarakan oil fields, an objective pursued with a terrible calculus of loss. On the vellum overlay, the 3 red grease pencil circles are clean, precise, abstract. They represent coordinates, targets. A problem to be solved by parachute and by fire. For the 8 Australians of Z Special Unit, retrained from the dust and fire of North Africa, it was the start of a descent into a world that defied all maps. A world of suffocating green damp. A world where the enemy was not just the Japanese Imperial Army, but the jungle itself. The archives offer only whispers of the reality. They are a ledger of ghosts. We read the inventory lists. A portable radio they could not risk using, its silence a constant heavy companion. 50 memorized words of broken Malay, a flimsy bridge to an entire civilization. And the small, dark promise of the cyanide pill, a testament to the horrors they expected to face, a final act of control in a world where they had none. We see the casualty reports from the coast, the 160-mile trail of forced marches and casual murder that had seeded the jungle floor with the bodies of the fallen. They were sent to avenge those ghosts, to become ghosts themselves if necessary. Then a single cryptic signal from the deep interior. A report from Sergeant Ken Thompson, Z Special Unit, dated July 10th. Engaged patrol of 12 Japs near Long Barang. Engaged. What did that single sterile word truly mean in a place where your only allies were men with long hair, shields painted with demonic faces, and parang ilang swords that looked more like a butcher's cleaver than a soldier's weapon? Did it mean a firefight? An ambush? Or did it mean a ritual of violence so ancient and profound that it could never be entered into an army logbook? The records do not say. They simply stop. The silence that follows is more revealing than any report. A silence from the jungle. A silence in the archives. Because the numbers tell one story, a story of failure. The Tarakan oil fields, so thoroughly demolished by their retreating defenders, produced nothing of value for the Allied war effort. A strategic null. But the real story is not in the numbers. It is in the transformations. It is in what happened between the lines of Sergeant Thompson's final message. It is in how men who had tasted the grit of the desert learned to read the soul of the jungle. How enemies of the state became brothers in arms. They arrived as soldiers, instruments of a foreign war. They were met by warriors, guardians of an ancient world. They brought the logic of military objectives. They were met with the wisdom of survival. This was not a mission of conquest. It was one of immersion, a descent into a partnership that defied every convention of modern warfare. The true currency of this operation was not the oil they sought or the intelligence they gathered. It was trust, a fragile commodity offered in the quiet sharing of a sago meal, forged in the terror of a nighttime hunt, sealed in the blood of a common enemy. For the Dayak, this was not a world war. It was the defense of their home, and they found in these strange, pale men from the sky an unexpected instrument for their own ancestral justice. For the Australians, they discovered that the most effective weapon in the jungle was not their Sten gun. It was the man standing beside them, a man whose grandfather might have taken a head for a trophy, but who now offered his life for a stranger. What became of this bond when the warplanes flew home? What quiet promises were made under the canopy that were never spoken of again? History loves neat conclusions. It loves to celebrate the grand strategies and forget the messy human alliances that truly turned the tide. The survivors, both Australian and Dayak, returned to their own worlds, bound by a shared experience too raw, too sacred, or perhaps too savage for peacetime conversation. They fell silent. Some secrets die with those who kept them. Others live forever. Between the lines of a redacted file, between the living memory of a tribe, between the silence. The war for the Pacific is over. Its victors and vanquished have been named. But perhaps the tidy narrative of history is the greatest fiction of all. Perhaps the real spoils of war were never about territory or resources. Perhaps they were about something far simpler and more profound. The discovery that enemies are just strangers you have not bled with yet. And in the deep, unmapped wilderness of the human heart, some alliances never end. They do not fade. They simply wait in the shadows of memory, carved in bone, ready to be rediscovered.